Go slow, it hurts.
I'll die before I hurt you.
Go slow, it hurts. She moaned, he whispered, I'll die before I hurt you. Vertical bar, Wild West stories. In the searing heat of August, 1868, a suffocating silence had fallen over the dust-choked plains surrounding Dead Man's Gulch, Arizona. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, the air so thick with grit and the scent of sun-baked earth that it felt like breathing dust. The sun, a relentless brass hammer in the sky, beat down on the cracked ground where nothing but the most stubborn sagebrush dared to grow. It was a place that didn't just test a man. It stripped him down to his bone and sinew, asking if he was worth more than the dirt he'd be buried in. My name is Elias Thorne, and I had lived in this desolate stretch of the territory for 7 years, a hermit by choice. A soul worn thin by the ghosts of a past I couldn't outride. My homestead was a collection of faded canvas tents and a lean-to of crooked juniper branches, a temporary refuge against a world that had long since forgotten me. I had been content with my solitude, finding a grim kind of peace in the predictable routine of my days. I tended to my small herd of goats, their bleating the only sound that broke the unending silence. My hands, calloused and thick with the history of hard labor, had learned to find rhythm in the simple acts of mending fences and patching torn canvas. My face, etched with lines from years of sun and silence, was a testament to a life lived on the fringes. I had chosen this life of isolation, believing that to be alone was to be safe, that to be unseen was to be unjudged. I had no one to mourn, no one to disappoint, and no one to leave. My life had become a predictable, repeating cycle of survival, a quiet war waged against the unyielding landscape. I had told myself that this was enough, but then the quiet broke. It wasn't the wind, nor the familiar lowing of my goats. It was a sharp, unnatural sound, a single gunshot that echoed like a scream off the distant rock formations of the gulch. A moment later, a plume of thick black smoke snaked into the sky, a stark, violent scar against the pale blue. It was the kind of sign a man in this country learns to fear: trouble, born of a kind that doesn't respect fences or solitude. My body, which had been so used to the slow pace of isolation, reacted before my mind could. My hand went to the worn grip of my revolver, the cold steel a familiar comfort against my palm. I knew, with the certainty of a man who has seen too much, that the past I had buried so deeply was about to come crawling back out of the ground. The land had broken its promise of quiet, and I had no choice but to answer its call. I was a man of action, not words. I checked my revolver, slid it into its holster, grabbed my rifle, and started toward the smoke. I had no idea what waited for me there, but my gut told me it would be a reckoning. I was mending a fence along the southern line when I heard it, a sound with a human edge that cut through wind and flies. Not cattle, not a hawk's scream, a voice hurt, sudden, and the rattle of wood striking stone, then the clatter of a buckboard gone wrong, and curses snatched thin by the air. My gut pulled tight. Trouble doesn't need a name to be recognized. I unlooped the reins, swung into the saddle, and pushed toward the dry gulch. My palm sat easy on the worn stock of the Winchester. I didn't know what waited ahead, only that old instincts had begun to wake like wolves in my bones, stretching, testing the air. The gelding took the slope sure-footed, and I let him, my eyes feeling for motion, my ears listening for anything that didn't belong to wind or rock. 5 minutes brought me to a rise above the wash. My bay stopped on his own, ears forward. Below us lay a bright wreckage, a buckboard on its side, one wheel, spinning like a coin, deciding which face to land on. 2 men in dusters strained at the shattered frame, trying to free a third whose leg was pinned. Off to the right, a wiry man with a scar running toward his jaw paced and spat, the cold in his eyes older than his face. I knew his sort. He was the kind that called cruelty a craft and himself its foreman, the kind that lets other men bleed to save his own skin and calls it leadership. Then I saw her. She was tangled in splintered boards near the buckboard's belly, a small figure in a torn leather dress dark with blood. One hand pressed her ribs, but the stain kept blooming. Strands of black hair were snagged on a spike of wood, some torn free and fluttering like crow feathers in the grit. Apache, by the cast of her features and the way her jaw set against the pane. Her face carried a hurt too deep for noise, the kind that had already been explained to the body and needed no more words. They hadn't seen me yet. For a long blink I owned a perfect shot at the scarred man, but my aim slid to the girl and stayed there. I didn't blame the war for the chief who died. I blamed men like these men who turned people into prizes, who wrapped a bounty paper around a life and called it lawful. Whatever I had buried in myself clawed upward and would not be quiet. I could not ride away. I slipped from the saddle, moved behind a stand of mesquite, shouldered the rifle, and fired a single round. The shot bit a plank from the wrecked wagon. The men froze and their eyes climbed the rise like ants tasting sugar. "Get out," I called, my voice low and flat enough to carry. "This isn't your land, and that isn't your prize." The scarred one found me first. He tilted a smile that showed yellow. "A lone wolf wants to howl," he said, voice slick as lamp oil. "That's our bounty. Stolen goods. She brings a price." I put another round into the dust between his boots. He jerked back, the smile turning to a knife. "Leave her," I said, "and get off my land." Then, he measured me a heartbeat longer than a coward needs, then glanced at the wreck, the pinned man screaming, the girl bleeding. His eyes returned to mine, and I could see the arithmetic behind them: risk, distance, the way a single rifle at elevation can turn one man into a problem three men don't want. "This isn't over, Viper," he said, tasting the name he had for me. "She's worth money. I'll come take it." He swung up and rode away, letting his men puzzle out the rest. He didn't spare a look for the man under the wheel. He didn't spare a look for anything but the path that would bring him back. That's the thing about men like him, they keep their promises when the promise is vengeance paid in other people's blood. I waited until the dust laid down, then I walked into the wash with the rifle ready. The girl's breath came shallow, blood gathered beneath her like a dark lake creeping into cracks. I knelt. Her eyes found mine glassy, but steady. No plea in them, just a hard clarity that said she had survived other bad days and knew how to count this one. "All right," I said, "let's get you out." She could not stand. I slid the rifle under my arm, lifted her slow, and felt the weight of someone balanced on the edge of leaving. I had carried men off battlefields and drunks off floors. This was different. This was someone's daughter snagged in a snare laid by wolves. She made a small sound when I moved her, not quite a word, not quite a groan, something that carried more memory than breath. I got her across the saddle and climbed behind, one hand on the reins, the other holding her steady. Her breath fluttered against my shirt. It was warm, then cooler as we rode. The sun pushed west, and the shadows stretched long as tracks pointing toward evening. I didn't look back. Looking back makes a man slow, and slow gets measured in inches of earth over the chest. The cabin waited the way it always did. Timber walls, a stone hearth, a cot, a chair, a table, the small inventory of a life boiled down to what was needed and nothing showing off. I shouldered the door, set her on the bed, lit the lamp, and let the yellow light chase the room's edges. Water to boil, needle and thread, knife bright from the drawer. My hands knew the order. My mind was a tight circle with only one way through. I cut the leather where the blood had stiffened, cleaned what I could, and found the path the bullet had torn. Flesh and muscle broken, bones spared. Luck, if that word still walked this earth. She shuddered when the hot water met the wound. Her hand clenched, then loosened like a fist, remembering it could be a hand again. "Hurts," I said, to tell her I knew. This part always does. For an hour I stitched and bound. The fire kept a low conversation in the hearth. Outside, the desert held its breath like a singer waiting on the first note. I worked by lamp and habit, pulling the edges together with small, neat bites, tying off where the blood wanted to argue, laying clean linen where the flesh needed help to remember itself. When I finished, I sat in the chair and watched the small climb and fall of her ribs. Barely there, but there. I poured a little water to her mouth and she swallowed without waking, the swallow of a person whose body has not yet asked for permission. She did not speak the first night, nor the second. Each morning I changed the bandage and felt for fever. I spooned broth past her cracked lips and waited for the throat to take it. When sweat beaded on her brow, I dabbed it away with cloth cooled in the basin. When her eyes opened, they stayed watchful, following me across the room like a hawk tracks a field. No trust in them, not yet, but no panic either. I asked nothing. I had learned how questions can pull the wrong thread and make everything come apart. Between tending and waiting, I kept the ranch moving. Horses watered, lines checked, wood split to a rhythm that didn't need thinking. The work made a metronome for the day. Only now that rhythm answered to another meter, the thin whisper of her breathing, the way her chest lifted against the linen, the small crease at the corner of her eye when I retied a knot or adjusted a wrap. Silence had a new shape in the cabin, not empty anymore, but full of the weight of two lives, one lying down and one walking circles around it. Sometimes, in the quietest part of afternoon, the old ride would return to me dust high as a veil, the chief's horse stepping careful, the promise of peace carried like a lantern that didn't reach the ground. The memory didn't burn as hot as before. It just sat where it always had, a stone at the bottom of the water. I would look over at the girl on the cot and feel the stone shift. I wasn't trying to redeem myself. I had no illusion that I could erase my past. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was fighting for something more than survival. There are noises a desert makes that a man learns to love. The small talk of wind around a doorframe, the creak of a board when night settles its weight, the cluck of a horse shifting in straw. There are other noises that are too loud even when they're quiet. That third morning, a crow camped on the fence rail and argued with itself until I tossed a pebble and sent it elsewhere. By evening, the sky had gone the long color between brass and blue, and the first coyotes tried a chorus. The girl slept. The fire sank. I sharpened the knife I had already used, not because it needed it, but because the scrape of stone on steel is a way to make the minutes honest. Scar had seen my cabin from the rise. He knew what I had taken from him and where I had taken it. Men like him measure time differently, not in hours, but in grudges. He had ridden away only to ride a circle that would bring him back with the arithmetic solved to his liking. I knew he would return. Knowing is a burden you carry in your shoulders. You feel it when you reach for your coat and when you set a pot to hang. You feel it when you lay a log and when you blow a coal to life. On the fourth morning, the world felt carved from glass. No wind, no coyotes. Even the crow had the sense to hold its tongue. The light came up pale and slow, as if it were afraid to touch the ground. I stepped outside with my coat tight, and my rifle leaned in the crook of my arm. Frost on the water bucket made a gray skin that cracked like old paint when I tipped it. I could feel the desert listening. I could feel the old instincts pawing the floor of their stall. Somewhere out there, Scar's promise paced in a circle, wearing a path that led straight to my door. I walked the line from the corral to the south fence and back again, not hurrying, the way a man walks when hurry would admit to fear. The bay watched me with one ear and the horizon with the other. I set the latch on the gate twice. I stood with the sun still a rumor behind the ridges and counted the slow seconds it took for the first light to find the tips of grass and then the backs of stones. The cabin behind me was warm with a small fire and the soft breath of a woman who had not yet decided to live. The land in front of me had seen blood. It would see it again. I did not know whose. I went back inside and checked the bandage once more. The wound looked clean as wounds go, the angry red at the edges settling into a duller color. She stirred when I lifted the cloth, then slept again, the way a weary body bargains with morning. I set the basin down, sat in the chair, and rested the rifle against my leg. The fire cracked once, like a knuckle. The lamplight held steady. There's a way a room feels when it waits. It's not just the quiet, it's the tilt of every object toward a single question. Chair to door, door to yard, yard to horizon. My life had been tilted like that before. I had pretended I could make it level by riding away from people and toward work. I knew better now. The tilt follows a man who still has a pulse and a memory. I listened to her breathe. I listened to my own. The two sounds found a pace that made sense of the morning, and for a while that was all there was. Breath, fire, light. Then, Because a man must do something with his hands when he cannot change the world, I trimmed a loose thread from the linen and folded it into my pocket. I rubbed a stain from the stock of the rifle that I knew would not rub out. I tightened the screw on the lamp, not because it was loose, but because I needed something to answer to the word ready. Out beyond the door, the day brightened. I did not step out to meet it. I stayed where I was, inside the square of timber I had built with years and stubbornness, and let the light come find me. If Scar was out there, he would come when he chose. If the girl on the bed chose to live, she would open her eyes when she chose. A man can choose only his side of such bargains. I settled deeper in the chair and watched the line where shadow gave the wall back to itself. The bay stamped once in the corral, then stood quiet. Somewhere, far off, a hawk wrote its name on the air. The sound didn't reach the cabin, but the knowledge of it did, the way a memory does a shape moving where you cannot see it, but certain enough to count. I closed my eyes for the length of a breath and opened them again, measuring the room as if it might have changed. It had not. The lamp, the fire, the cot, the chair, the woman, the rifle, all of it in its place. I took another breath and let it go. I wasn't praying. I'd left that kind of asking behind a long time ago. I was just staying, which is its own kind of courage when a man has spent most of his life leaving. And so I waited, with the rifle within reach and the fire banked low, listening to the small sound of someone else's life working its way back toward the world, and to the larger sound of a land that had already decided what it was and would tolerate no arguments. The sun went on climbing. The light went on widening. The promise Scar had made kept walking the earth somewhere beyond my fence, patient as hunger and just as sure. I did not move to meet it. I did not move to run. I stayed where I was, counting breaths, counting the quiet, until the cabin walls themselves seemed to breathe with me, and the morning held its balance like a coin between finger and thumb, waiting to see which way it would fall. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. I went back to the barn, meaning only to check the feed bins, the way a man checks the locks at night, not because he doubts, but because habit is the only thing that keeps order in a world like this. The lantern light flickered, throwing long shadows across the beams, casting the barn in a half-light that made everything look larger than life. The mounds of hay stacked in corners, the leather tack hanging from nails, the smell of horse and dust thick in the air. It was the familiar kind of silence that comes when the day's work is done and the world holds its breath before nightfall. The quiet was never perfect, not here, but it was mine. The barn had witnessed everything, every piece of sweat that soaked into my shirt, every time I had cursed the land for being too harsh or the weather for being too fickle, and every time I had found peace in its unyielding nature. The barn had its own rhythm, one that had settled into my bones over the years. It wasn't just wood and hay. It was a living, breathing thing, a companion to the years I had spent here. Every year added something new to its memory, another nail driven into the beams, another fence mended, another animal raised from birth to slaughter. The barn had seen it all, and I had come to see it as home, where the smell of fresh hay and the creak of old wood were more familiar than any person I had known. It was here, in this place of solitude and hard work, that I had learned who I was, what I was, a man of simple needs and complicated regrets, a rancher, a survivor, and perhaps, in some ways, a man too stubborn to admit that he had been running from something far bigger than the work he had surrounded himself with. Tonight, the air was still, thick with the scent of hay, leather, and the quiet hum of life that always filled the space after the day's chores were done. The beams above, worn smooth with the passage of time, cast shadows that seemed to stretch across the entire barn, and for a moment, the whole place felt larger than it was. It felt as if it was suffocating me, or maybe it was me who was suffocating it. The silence had a different texture tonight. It was the kind of quiet you feel when you're not sure if you're alone with your thoughts or if your thoughts are becoming something else entirely. I stood there for a while, listening to the soft breathing of the horses in their stalls. The steady rustle of their hooves against the straw was the only sound. The world outside, the one full of dangers and promises I didn't quite understand, seemed so distant here. This was my sanctuary, and yet tonight, something felt off. The barn was still, but something in the air told me it wouldn't stay that way for long. My eyes moved across the stalls, the tack, the clutter of tools, and stopped on the old satchel sitting half-hidden on the workbench. It had been there for weeks, buried beneath a coil of wire and the broken strap of a bridle I kept meaning to mend. The satchel looked like nothing much faded canvas, the leather straps worn down to threads, but it carried a weight that seemed heavier than it should. Inside were 3 sticks of dynamite wrapped in wax paper. I had traded for them 2 months back from a miner headed north, a quiet man with soot still ground into his knuckles. The sticks weren't meant for war. They were tools, the way a shovel or a pick is a tool meant to split stubborn rock along the fence line or carve a shallow trench to turn rainwater into a gully. I had bought them with no real intention of ever using them. It was a practical decision, nothing more. Out here, tools like dynamite weren't just a luxury, they were a necessity. The land didn't bend easily. It fought every attempt at taming. Sometimes, when the soil wouldn't yield, or the rocks were too stubborn, a man needed more than just his hands. He needed the power to make the earth bend to his will. And so, dynamite found its way into the tool shed, like any other tool a rancher might need. But standing here now, I wasn't sure I'd ever thought through what it meant to carry it. A rifle, a knife, a spade, they were all familiar companions. They were simple, easy to understand. But the dynamite, it was different. It was power, pure and uncontained. In the wrong hands, it could tear everything down. In the right hands, it could carve a way forward. But right now, I was no longer sure what I was holding in my hands, or if it was me who was holding it, or if it was holding me. I watched the satchel for a long moment, as if expecting it to tell me what to do. I didn't even know why I was hesitating. I had kept it close all this time, as though the mere presence of it gave me a measure of control, but now it felt like a choice I wasn't ready to make. I thought back to the day I'd traded for it, the quiet miner with his eyes sunken and worn, his hands calloused like stone. I had bought it without hesitation, but now, standing in the soft glow of the lantern, the weight of the decision felt like it had grown too large to carry. Out here, where the land fought every attempt at taming, dynamite was as much a rancher's tool as a plow. Sometimes it was the only way to shift a stubborn ridge, or open a dry gully for water runoff, or blast through solid stone when it refused to give. And though I had never planned on using them, I had kept them close. There was a kind of uneasy comfort in knowing they were there. Powder and promise, tucked away for when the earth refused to yield, but this comfort was deceptive, like a man who clings to a sword but fears the weight of its blade. The dynamite wasn't just a tool, it was a reminder that sometimes, when the land doesn't bend, and the world around you is all edges and shadows, a man has to make the earth yield to him, or break under its weight. What kind of man was I becoming, keeping a thing like that so close? The land out here didn't care much for a man's plans. It had its own rhythm, its own agenda. It bent to no one. A fence can be mended, the grass can be watered, and the cattle can be herded, but the land's a beast of its own. You don't tame it, you simply try to coax it, bargain with it. And when that doesn't work, when the land refuses to give, when the earth laughs at your attempts to make it bend to your will, that's when a man turns to what he's got left. Tools like dynamite, made for carving new ways through a stone-cold earth, or creating paths where none existed before. I had never planned to use them, but I had learned long ago that you keep everything close when the world outside demands so much. There was something about knowing the dynamite was there like a small flicker of control in a world where nothing was ever in control. It gave me comfort, even if it was a dangerous comfort. There's a thin line between preparedness and recklessness, and I knew I had stepped too close to that line more than once. But in this world, you don't wait for permission to act. You make your choices, for better or worse. Still, I had never liked the idea of keeping explosives so close. It felt dangerous, even reckless. But there was also something about it, something in my gut that told me out here, when the world got bigger than your fences, and the sky stretched like a canvas painted with storms, Dynamite was as valuable as a rifle, maybe more. Just the thought of having it close at hand made the days feel a little safer, a little more in control. It wasn't the kind of thing I would ever admit aloud. It felt reckless to keep explosives so close, like carrying a matchstick in a powder keg. Yet, there was a part of me, buried deep in the back of my mind, that understood. When the land is so vast, so untamed, and everything around you feels like it could collapse at any moment, dynamite, like a rifle, was a necessary evil. Out here, in a world where the weather didn't care about your crops, and the wild things still roamed free, dynamite could be the difference between life and death. Maybe more. It was power, and power makes men feel safe, even when they know it's dangerous. I picked up one of the sticks and turned it in my hand. It didn't look like much. Just a paper tube sealed with wax, powder packed inside, a short fuse waiting. But it carried weight, not only the heft of its contents, but the burden of what it meant. A choice between creation and destruction, between shaping the land or tearing men apart. I slid it into the inside pocket of my coat without thinking, the way a rancher slips a knife into his boot. Habit. Insurance. A man never knew what the day might bring. And lately, with Scar prowling the country roads like a coyote hunting weak calves, I trusted habit far more than luck. The stick of dynamite felt solid in my hand, and for a moment, I just turned it, studying it, as if I were studying the idea of destruction itself. It wasn't heavy, just a paper tube, waxed and sealed, a short fuse snaking out from its end. Yet, the weight of it was more than just the physical heft. It was the weight of decisions, of what might come next. In the hands of a man who knew how to use it, it could be the tool that carved out new paths, or it could burn everything down in a flash. A weapon or a tool, it was a choice. I slipped it into the inside pocket of my coat, the same way a rancher might slip a knife into his boot, a habit, something done without thinking. Insurance. A man never knew what the day might bring. And lately, with Scar prowling the country roads like a coyote hunting weak calves, I trusted my instincts more than luck. Survival out here didn't care about fairness. It only cared about who made the first move. By the time I carried water to the horses, the satchel was shut again, tucked back beneath the tools, looking once more like nothing at all. I told myself I didn't plan on using what I carried. I told myself it was foolish, dangerous, even to keep fire so close to my chest. But another voice, quieter and older, reminded me of all the things I had once sworn I would never need again. The rifle that leaned by my bed, the scout's saddle I still oiled once a month, the knife I sharpened every night before the fire. Promises made in peace rot in war. And though I tried to live as a rancher, peace was a thin cloak. It tore the moment Scar rode into my life. The satchel was tucked back into place, looking just like any other piece of clutter, and that was how I wanted it. Out of sight, out of mind. But the truth was, it never left my mind. I knew what it could do, and I knew how dangerous it was. Every time I touched it, there was a small, quiet voice in my head telling me to walk away, to live simply and peacefully. But that voice was quieter than the one reminding me how quickly the world could turn to dust. The rifle leaned by my bed, a constant reminder of what had happened before. The saddle I oiled every month, the knife I sharpened by the fire, it was all part of the life I had built. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was the way things had always been. The night stretched on, and the weight of the decision I'd made earlier seemed to settle deeper into my bone. The barn was quiet, save for the occasional shift of the horses or the rustling of the hay as the wind began to stir outside. I let my mind wander as I moved around the space, picking up the small tools I'd left scattered here and there, my hands moving mechanically as I worked. The familiar motions gave me something to focus on, but it did little to ease the feeling gnawing at the pit of my stomach. It was a feeling that had been growing steadily since the moment I decided to take the dynamite. What kind of man was I becoming? What had I already become? I could feel the presence of the dynamite in my coat pocket, like a heavy weight pulling me down. It was a power I had no intention of using, at least, not unless I absolutely had to, but the temptation lingered. Just the idea of having it there, of knowing it was within arm's reach, gave me a strange sense of control. The land, the cattle, the work, it was all such a fight. But with dynamite, with that small, deadly tool, I could force the earth to yield. I could carve a path where there was none. I could change the course of the world, if only for a moment. It was power. And power, though dangerous, was something I craved, especially now. The barn was no longer just a barn to me. It had become a place where I confronted my own demons, where I wrestled with the kind of man I was and the kind of man I wanted to be. Each nail, each board, each piece of hay was a testament to the life I had built, but it was also a reminder of the man who had failed, the man who had been forced to leave it all behind. The weight of that failure sat on my shoulders, a burden I couldn't shake. But there was something else, something I hadn't felt in years, a small, flickering hope. The thought of Ilara, of the way she had held me steady during the worst of it. She had been there, guiding me through the chaos, showing me that survival wasn't just about fighting or running, it was about finding something worth fighting for, even if it was just a quiet moment under the stars. I looked toward the door, the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the cracks in the barn's walls. The night was calm, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Scar was still out there, hunting, waiting for his chance. The thought of him sent a shiver down my spine. He was a man who didn't forgive, a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. And if he found me, if he found Ilara, there would be no escaping him. I moved to the window, my hand resting on the sill as I stared out at the vast, barren land stretching out before me. The moonlight painted everything in shades of silver and gray, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could escape this life. But the thought was fleeting, crushed under the weight of reality. Scar wasn't the only threat. The land, the desert, the isolation, it was all a reminder that I was never truly free. And the longer I stayed here, in this place that had once been my sanctuary, the more I realized that it would never be enough. It wasn't just the land that had changed. It was me. The barn creaked behind me, the sound a stark contrast to the stillness outside. I turned, my eyes falling once again on the satchel resting on the workbench. The dynamite, the power it represented. It was a choice, one I wasn't sure I was ready to make, but one I knew was coming. The thought of facing Scar without it, without some kind of advantage, was unimaginable. Yet, I couldn't ignore the unease that clung to me. I had already come too far. What would I be willing to do next? I let out a slow breath, my mind racing as I considered all the possibilities. There had to be another way. But in this world, in this place where the stakes were so high, I knew there were no easy answers. Sometimes, survival wasn't just about doing what was right, it was about doing what was necessary. I shook my head, trying to clear the thoughts that swirled around in my mind. The barn was no longer my refuge. It had become a prison, a place where my choices had led me, a place where the past I had tried to escape continued to haunt me. I reached for the satchel once more, my fingers brushing against the rough canvas. The weight inside seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. I had made mistakes too many to count, but I had also made promises. Promises to Ilara, promises to myself. I wasn't the man I had been, but I wasn't sure who I was becoming either. And that uncertainty was something I couldn't shake. It gnawed at me, making every decision feel like a gamble, every action a step toward something I couldn't quite name. Ilara. Her face flashed in my mind, steady and resolute, guiding me through the storm. I had saved her. I had fought for her. And I would continue to do so, no matter the cost. I knew what I had to do. The choices I had made had already put me on a path I couldn't turn away from. The dynamite was just another tool, another weapon in the fight for survival. I didn't have the luxury of second chances. I had to move forward. With a steady hand, I grabbed the satchel and slung it over my shoulder. The decision had been made. There was no turning back now. The land, the people, the violence, it was all part of the world I had chosen. But now, it was time to fight for something more. It was time to find out what kind of man I was going to become. I walked toward the door, the weight of the dynamite pressing against me, the quiet night stretching out before me like an uncertain future. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. The rest of that day was a blur of sun, shadow, and pain. Every step we took felt like a slow-motion battle against the world, as though the earth itself wanted to swallow us up. Ilara and I moved away from the cabin, the lingering scent of gunpowder thick in the air, reminding me of the violence that had just unfolded. The weight of the decision I had made pressed against me like the sun's relentless heat. The bullet in my shoulder throbbed with every movement, a cruel reminder of the choices that had led me here. My world had been upended for a woman I had met only days ago. I had risked everything, my life, my pride, everything I'd known for someone I barely understood. And yet, as the pain tore through my body, I felt something else too, something quieter. A part of me, some long-dead piece, was grateful. For the first time in years, the ghosts that haunted my past had fallen silent, their voices muffled beneath the weight of the moment. We were on the run, together. No longer just a man and a woman caught in a fight they never asked for, but two souls bound by the same brutal fate. The cabin was behind us now, and with it, any hope of returning to the life I had known. We couldn't go back. The world I had lived in was gone, swallowed by blood and fire. The land stretched out before us, barren and unyielding. We found shelter in a small, rocky outcropping as the sun began to set, casting violent shades of orange and red across the sky. I slumped against the cool stone, my breath ragged, my body screaming for rest. The air was dry, too dry, and the taste of dust and blood lingered in my mouth. Every breath felt like it was dragging me deeper into a fevered haze. Ilara, despite her own wound, was a whirlwind of quiet efficiency. She moved like someone who had lived this life before, who understood what it meant to survive when everything else was trying to kill you. She gathered brushwood for a small fire, careful to keep the smoke to a minimum, her movements fluid, practiced. She found a patch of moss and herbs and began to crush them with a smooth stone, her hands steady despite the tremble in her fingers. Her gaze never wavered, focused entirely on the task. She wasn't just surviving, she was living. The firelight caught her face, casting shadows that seemed to soften the hard edges of the world around us. She was the sun, blooming in the heart of the desert, a reminder that survival wasn't just about getting by, it was about living in the moment, even when every step felt like it might be your last. She knelt beside me, her eyes scanning my shoulder with quiet expertise. "It must come out," she said, her voice a soft command that left no room for argument. I didn't argue. I didn't have the strength. My body felt like it was falling apart, each movement a struggle against the tide of pain that pulled at me. She didn't have a knife, so she used a shard of obsidian she'd found along the way. The stone was sharp, jagged, its edge glinting in the firelight like a weapon forged by the land itself. Her hands were steady, her gaze unflinching. I watched her work, my head spinning from the fever and the pain. The world around me faded, the firelight blurring into a haze of red and orange. But her presence remained solid, grounding, steady, unshakable. She was a healer, a woman who knew the land and its secrets, who had lived with its dangers and its beauty in equal measure. As she worked, I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. Trust in her strength, in her ability to do what had to be done. When she was done, she wrapped my shoulder with a strip of her dress, the fabric soft against my raw skin. She then tore another piece, wrapped her own wound, and looked up at me, her eyes meeting mine with an intensity that made me swallow hard. "My people," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but filled with a quiet power. "We have a place, a hidden place. I can take you there." I hesitated. I had spent my life avoiding the Apache, the people I had failed. Going to their home, after everything I had done, felt like a leap of faith I wasn't sure I could make. I had seen too much of what men like me had done to them, too much blood spilled, too many lives torn apart. But I looked at her quiet strength, and knew I had no other choice. She was my only chance. The journey was a blur of pain and determination. My body was weak, losing blood with every step, my legs trembling beneath me as I staggered forward. The world around us was a blur of dust, shadows, and the occasional flash of light as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Ilara guided me, her hand steady on my back, her voice a soft murmur of encouragement that kept me moving even when I thought I couldn't take another step. She told me stories of her people, of the canyons and deserts they called home, of the long walk that had taken so much from them. She spoke not for pity, but to show me who she was, where she came from, the strength that flowed through her blood. She told me of the man who had betrayed her people, the one who had put a bounty on her head. I didn't ask why. I already knew. I had seen the cruelty that men like Scar were capable of. The night deepened, and so did the fever burning in my blood. The wound wasn't clean, it had torn through muscle, leaving splinters of bone aching with each move. My vision blurred, and every stumble felt like it might be my last. But Ilara never faltered. She kept me upright with a strength I wouldn't have believed possible from someone so small. At times, she spoke softly in her own tongue, words I didn't understand but felt like a tether to the world. Her voice was a constant, a reminder that I wasn't alone, that I was still fighting, still alive. When the fever broke into shivers, she stopped, pressing me down against the sand. She pulled roots, dried leaves, and a small bundle of crushed bark from her pouch. She chewed them slowly, mixed them with water, and pressed the bitter paste to my lips. I tried to turn away, the taste foul and bitter on my tongue, but she forced it between my teeth with surprising force. "Swallow," she commanded. I obeyed. The taste was unbearable, but warmth spread through my chest, dulling the fire in my shoulder, just enough for me to breathe again. The world swam back into focus, and I could feel the weight of her hands on me, the soft touch of her skin, a reminder that I was not alone. We camped that night beneath a red stone ledge. The stars above us twinkled like distant lanterns, casting a dim light across the land. Ilara built no fire, only covered me with her blanket, whispering that smoke might give us away. I drifted in and out of blackness, each time waking to her face above mine, her hand on my brow, checking for death. She didn't allow me to give up, even when part of me begged for the quiet end of it. By the second day, my strength was nearly gone. The wound had clotted, but the fever came in waves, drenching me in sweat, making every step feel like it might be my last. Ilara forced me onward with patience and fury alike. She sang low songs of endurance, songs her people had passed down through the generations. Once, when I fell to my knees, exhausted and in pain, she pressed her forehead to mine. "If you stop here, you stop forever," she said, her eyes burning with defiance. The land seemed to conspire against us. Shale cut my boots. The sun pressed down like a hammer. Buzzards circled overhead, waiting for collapse. But Ilara knew the desert as her own body. She led us to hidden springs, to shade beneath cottonwoods, to cactus fruit, whose juice she pressed to my lips, keeping me alive one bitter mouthful at a time. At dusk of the third day, I nearly bled out. The bandage slipped, the clot torn when I fell against rocks. Blood soaked my shirt. My vision went white, then red, and then nothing. When I woke, the sky was full of stars. Ilara crouched over me, her hands stained with blood. She had pressed hot stones against the wound, chanting words older than the canyon. Pain ripped through me, sharper than any I had known, but it dragged me back to consciousness. "You will not die here," she said. Not a plea, but a command. Every step after that was borrowed time, my body moving only by her will. She had become the spirit I thought buried with the men I failed. By the time we reached the throat of the hidden canyon, I was more specter than man, carried by her resolve. And yet, when I saw the first hints of the canyon walls of sandstone rising like cathedrals, painted by the morning sun, I felt something stir within me. Survival was no longer just a debt to her, it was a promise. Ilara had carried me across the threshold of death itself, and I owed her more than life. I owed her a future, one where her people would never again suffer betrayal from men like me. We reached the entrance to the Apache stronghold at dawn, the sun a distant promise on the horizon. The canyon was a labyrinth of rock and shadow, a natural fortress, Ilara led me through a narrow passage, and then we were there. It was a hidden world, a world of ancient stone and whispered prayers. I was a stranger in a strange land, and I could feel the eyes of the Apache on me, their gazes filled with suspicion and wariness. They saw a white man, a soldier, a ghost of the past. They didn't see the man who had saved one of their own. An elder, a man with a face as weathered as the rock walls themselves, stepped forward. He looked at me, then at Ilara, his eyes a cold, hard challenge. "Why have you brought this man here, Ilara?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly sound. Ilara stepped forward, her body a shield between me and the elder. "He saved my life, grandfather," she said, her voice strong and clear. "He risked his own to save mine. He is a man of honor." The elder looked at me, a long, searching look. "Honor?" he scoffed. "A white man's honor is a flimsy thing, a lie told to justify their greed. My gut told me to fight, to justify myself. But Ilara's words, her quiet strength, held me back. I knew I couldn't fight them. I had to earn their trust. I had to prove I was worthy. I had to show them, not tell them. I was a man of action, not words. I was Viper. I let go of her hand and stepped forward, facing the elder. "I don't expect you to believe me," I said, my voice low and steady. "I have made mistakes. I have seen good men die because of my own foolishness. I have lived with that shame for a decade. I didn't save your granddaughter for glory or for money. I saved her because it was the right thing to do, and if you want to kill me, then do it. But know this, I am no longer the man I was. I am a man who fights for what is right, not for what is easy." The elder looked at me, his eyes searching mine for any sign of a lie. He saw none. He saw a man who was broken, a man who was burdened by his past, but a man who was also seeking redemption. He saw me. He didn't see the soldier. He didn't see the ghost. He saw Jace Colton. "You may stay," he said, his voice a little softer this time, "but only under watch. Time will show if your words are truth, and you will not bring your kind of war to our home." Ilara took my hand, a small, grateful smile on her face. I had done it. I had passed the test. For the next few weeks, I lived among the Apache. It was a time of healing, a time of learning. Ilara nursed me back to health, her hands a gentle comfort, her voice a steady presence in my life. She taught me about the land, about the plants and their healing properties. She taught me about her people, about their traditions, about their history. She showed me a world I had long forgotten, a world of honor and resilience, a world I had once promised to protect. I watched her, saw her with her people, and I finally understood her. She was a woman who had been through hell and back, but she had never lost her spirit. She was a woman of strength and courage, a woman who had chosen to be a survivor instead of a victim. And in that quiet, hidden world, I found my purpose. Not as a soldier, not as a rancher, but as a man who had finally found his home. The days that followed felt like a blur of recovery and reflection. My body was slowly healing, but my mind was still torn, caught between the man I had been and the one I was trying to become. The Apache people were cautious, watching me from a distance, but their presence was steady and grounding. Each day, I learned something new, not just about their ways, but about myself. Ilara was patient, always by my side, guiding me through their customs and their way of life. The strength in her was like the wind, quiet, but relentless. We spent hours in the canyon, walking through the narrow passages, learning the land like it was a part of us. I had never known a place like this, so ancient, so full of life, in the way that only something untouched by time could be. The rocks, the plants, the wind, they all seemed to speak in a language I was just beginning to understand. It was here, amidst the silence of the desert, that I found clarity. The noise of the world outside faded, and for the first time in years, I could hear my own thoughts. Ilara and I would sit by the fire at night, watching the stars above. She would tell me stories of her people, of their strength and their resilience. Her voice was steady, each word carrying the weight of her history. I listened, not just to the words, but to the unspoken truth behind them. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a keeper of stories, of memories that had been passed down through generations. I had never asked for this life, but as I sat there, I began to realize that this, too, was part of my journey. I had run for so long, always trying to outrun the past. But now, with Ilara beside me, I felt the weight of it lift, if only for a moment. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, I felt like I was facing it with my eyes wide open. And as the days turned into weeks, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, redemption wasn't as far out of reach as I once thought. Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you. The weeks I spent in the canyon changed me. The wound in my shoulder healed, but the wounds on my soul began to mend as well. The Apache people, once suspicious, had begun to accept me. They didn't call me one of their own, but they had started to see me for what I was trying to become, a man seeking redemption, not a conqueror. They called me Hojo, a word that meant balance, harmony, and peace. It was a name I never thought I'd be worthy of. Surrounded by the Apache, I began to understand peace, not as a distant dream, but as something you learn to embrace in the silence between breaths and action. But here, in this canyon, surrounded by people who had suffered more than I could imagine, I wore the name with humility. It was as though the canyon itself had shaped me, turning the remnants of my bitterness into something softer, something kinder. In the days that followed, I discovered something new. I began to see the world through the lens of the Apache way of life. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was learning. I had spent so much of my life running from the past, running from the mistakes I had made, that I had forgotten what it meant to stop and listen. In this canyon, I had found a kind of peace, but not the kind I had once imagined. The peace I found was quiet. Still, sometimes uncomfortable, but it was real. For years, I ran from everything, my mistakes, my past, even myself. But here, with the Apache, I found something I never expected. Peace, not by escaping, but by standing still and facing what I had left behind, and maybe, just maybe, learning how to live with it. But the Apache people taught me that peace wasn't about running, it wasn't about escaping. It was about learning to face your past and carrying it with you, not letting it weigh you down. The canyon became a place of healing, not just for the wounds I had on my body, but for the scars that ran deeper, the ones no one could see. I learned more than how to bind wounds or gather herbs. I learned silence, and what it meant to listen to the wind scraping across the stone, to the laughter of children who had once run from me, to the prayers spoken softly at dawn. The lessons I absorbed weren't just about survival or physical strength. They were about learning how to exist with the world around me. Every face I met carried history, yet they did not let it become chains. They lived with a steadiness that humbled me, a way of walking the earth as though each step mattered, each breath counted. I began to realize that the Apache were not just survivors, they were masters of the land. They had lived through unimaginable pain, yet they never allowed that pain to define them. In the firelight, I was no longer just a man on the run. I was a man rediscovering what it meant to live with purpose. I no longer felt the weight of my rifle so heavily, as if the violence I had relied on for so long was no longer the only language I understood. Ilara, my eternal son, had given me peace and a reason to live again. She had taught me that love could grow even in the harshest of places, that it was possible to find something beautiful amidst the ashes. Love had bloomed in the most unlikely place, a war-torn desert. The thought seemed almost laughable when I first arrived. What was love in a place like this? But now, looking back at the time spent in the canyon, I could see how my life had shifted. Once consumed by bitterness, I had found solace in moments I never thought I'd cherish: the warmth of a fire on a cold night, the quiet hum of a story shared, and the steady glow of the sunset that promised a new beginning. These were things I had never truly understood until now. Ilara had shown me a different way to live, not in constant fight, but in acceptance. I didn't need to escape anymore, I needed to simply be. There were no demands, no wars to fight, no debts to pay. There was just the desert, the stars above, and the quiet hum of life moving forward. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe without the weight of guilt or regret pulling at me. When word spread that we would soon leave, there were no protests, no cries to make us stay. Instead, there were quiet nods, offerings of dried meat, blankets, and blessings whispered in Apache, a language I was beginning to understand, though I could barely grasp its full meaning. The elder's eyes softened as he pressed a hand to my shoulder. He did not forgive the past, but he acknowledged the man I was trying to become. It was the first time in my life I felt as though I wasn't being judged by who I had been, but by who I was becoming. The weight of my past had been lifted, not in a dramatic way, but slowly, over time. The Apache didn't believe in destiny, but they did believe in balance, and they had helped me find that balance within myself. As I walked through the canyon one last time, I felt every gaze upon me measuring, questioning, yet no longer condemning. The land itself seemed to hold me, reluctant to let go, but urging me onward. I understood then that peace was never a place to keep, but a gift to carry forward. It wasn't about being free of my past, but about carrying it in such a way that it didn't control me. The desert had taught me that the hardest part of living wasn't the battle, but the letting go of the shame, of the regret, of the guilt. One evening, as we sat by the fire, watching the stars bloom across the night sky, Ilara told me that the time had come for us to leave. The elder, her grandfather, had received word that Scar and his gang were still active, still looking for us, and had recently moved into a small town called Silver Peak. It was a place known for its lack of law and order. Rumor said he'd survived the bear scarred, meaner than before. Ilara's grandfather had asked her to leave, for my safety and for the safety of her people. It was a plea, not an order. I looked at her quiet resolve, and I knew what I had to do. The idea of leaving again, running from the past, was unbearable. I had spent too many years running, and for once, I was not going to turn tail and flee. This was my fight. Not just for me, but for the people who had given me refuge, for Ilara. I wouldn't run. Not this time. No, I said, my voice low and firm. We're not running. We're going to face them. Ilara's eyes widened in surprise. Jace, you can't. They're too many. You're no match for them. I took her hand, my fingers lacing with hers, the warmth of her skin, a reminder that I wasn't alone in this. I'm not the man I was, Ilara. I'm Hojo, and a man of harmony fights for what is right. I smiled, a weary smile that didn't quite reach my eyes, weighed down by everything we've been through. This isn't just a fight, Ilara. It's justice, a debt I owe not just to you, but to myself, to your people. It's something I have to make right. She looked at me, a flicker of fear in her eyes, but also a deep understanding. She knew that I couldn't run. Not after what had happened. We had to face our demons, together. She nodded, her hand tightening around mine. Then I will go with you, to fight by your side. The decision was made. We would leave the safety of the canyon, the peace we had found, and step back into the chaos we had left behind. We packed our belongings in silence, the weight of what was to come hanging over us. The elder lent us 2 tough ponies and a small prayer bundle for the trail. The Apache didn't believe in destiny, but in balance, and they had given us what they could for the road ahead. We rode for 2 days, our bodies tired, our minds focused. The wind blew hard against us, carrying with it the dust of distant places, a reminder that the world beyond the canyon was as unforgiving as ever. Silver Peak was a town that had long since lost its soul, a place where power was taken, not earned. The streets were filled with dust and despair, and men with guns ruled. The scent of fear hung in the air like smoke. The people had been crushed under the weight of Scar's rule for far too long. We found a small, quiet livery stable on the edge of town, a place where we could lay low and plan. Ilara was familiar with this kind of life, slipping into the shadows, watching, waiting. She had become a part of the land, moving with the grace of someone who had been shaped by it. We learned that Scar had set up shop in the saloon, a place called the Gilded Cage. He had become the law in this lawless place, his men a constant presence, their guns a silent threat. The townspeople were too afraid to stand up to him, their spirits broken, their hopes crushed. I couldn't just walk in and shoot him. It would be a mistake. I needed my training, my knowledge of the land. I had to be a ghost, blending into the background, waiting for the right moment. Ilera was my eyes and ears. She moved through the town with a quiet grace, unnoticed by the men who had once hunted her. She learned their routines, their habits, their weaknesses. She was a silent partner, a deadly force of nature. She was the one who told me that Scar had a shipment of silver coming in from a nearby mine. A small fortune that would give him the power he needed to take over the town for good. That was our chance. We waited for the silver to arrive. We watched as Scar's men unloaded the crates, their eyes darting around nervously, their hands twitching toward their guns. I saw the fear in their faces, the greed that had consumed their souls. They were just pawns in Scar's twisted game, just tools in his hands. But Scar himself was a different story. He was the snake, the poison that had infected this town, and I had no intention of letting him win. The sun began to set, casting long, menacing shadows across the street. The town was quiet, too quiet. The people stayed indoors, afraid to come out. I stood in the middle of the dusty street, my rifle in my hand, my heart steady, the rhythm of it a constant reminder that I was no longer the man I once was. I saw Scar step out of the saloon, his gait triumphant, a twisted smile on his face. He saw me. His smile faltered. He recognized me. "You," he snarled, his hand inching toward his gun. "You have a death wish, Viper?" "No," I said, my voice echoing in the silence. "I have a purpose." He drew his gun, fast, like a rattlesnake striking, but I saw it coming. My finger pulled the trigger before his shot rang out, not at him, but at the porch lamp above the saloon door. The glass shattered, plunging us into darkness. The glass shattered, plunging the street into darkness. Scar was a man who relied on sight, on brute force. I was a man who relied on instinct, on the shadows. He fired wildly, his bullets hitting the wall behind me. I moved, a shadow in the night, a ghost of the past. He was a good shot, but I was better. I had trained with the best. I had learned from the Apache. I was a man of the shadows. I moved, and then I was on him, rifle slung over my shoulder. My fist connected with his jaw, a loud, cracking sound. He fell to the ground, his gun clattering uselessly on the dirt. I stood over him, my rifle aimed at his head. The townspeople, emboldened by the darkness, had come out of their homes, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Justice is served," I said, my voice low and steady. "He is yours now. You can choose to live in the shadows, or you can choose to live in the light." Ilera, my quiet strength, stood beside me, her hand a reassuring presence on my back. We had done it. We had faced our demons, and we had won. We had not only saved ourselves, but we had given a town a second chance at life. The townspeople, once defeated, were now filled with a new hope. They had seen a man of honor, a man who had fought not for himself, but for them. I felt the shift in the air, the quiet of the townspeople. They were no longer afraid. Instead, they saw hope, a flicker of light in the darkness. Beneath the cold glow of the moon, we walked away from the street, leaving Scar and everything he had caused behind. But our journey did not end there. We hadn't just defeated Scar. We had defeated the fears that had haunted us for so long. Ilera and I made our way back toward the open plains, where the distant mountains stood firm like witnesses to every battle that had been fought. A sense of calm, one I had never known before, filled me. We had done something no one expected. We had brought light to a place consumed by darkness. And above all, I had learned that to truly live wasn't about running away or fighting until your last breath, but about finding peace within yourself, knowing that every action, every decision, held weight. With Ilera by my side, I no longer feared what lay ahead. Together, we would rebuild what had been lost, step by step, one day at a time. We walked in silence for a while, the weight of what we had just done hanging in the air like the dust settling around us. The town of Silver Peak, once dominated by fear, was now free, and I couldn't help but feel a small stir of pride deep inside me. But the pride was tempered by something else, a recognition that, while we had defeated Scar, the real work was only just beginning. It wasn't just about fighting battles, it was about healing the land, healing the people, and, perhaps most importantly, healing ourselves. Ilara's presence beside me was a steady anchor, a quiet strength that I had come to rely on more than I ever thought I would. She had shown me how to live without running, how to face the past without letting it control you. The bond between us had been forged through fire, and it was one that I couldn't easily break, nor would I ever want to. In her, I had found more than just a partner in survival. I had found a reason to keep going, to move forward, to rebuild. As we moved further from Silver Peak, the sounds of the town began to fade, replaced by the soft hum of the wind and the distant calls of birds. The world outside was quiet now, but it was the kind of quiet that didn't feel like suffocation. It felt like possibility. The sun was low on the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the desert landscape. It was a beautiful sight, one that reminded me how small I was in the grand scheme of things, and yet how much power a single life could have if it was willing to change. Ilara turned to me, her eyes reflecting the colors of the sky, a calm, steady gaze that told me everything I needed to know. She had no doubts about where we were going, and neither did I. We were moving towards something new, something better. The road ahead was long, but I knew that with her by my side, I would never be alone. "I think we've earned some peace," Ilara said softly, the words a quiet affirmation of the journey we had both been on. "But it's not about where we go, Jace. It's about how we live when we get there." Her words settled over me like a balm. I had spent so many years focused on the destination, on running from the past, on trying to outrun the mistakes I had made, that I had forgotten to appreciate the moments in between, the quiet moments, the moments that came when you were no longer running, but standing still, taking stock of everything you had fought for. I nodded, my heart lighter than it had been in years. I had spent so much time running, trying to outrun myself. But now, with Ilara, I felt like I was learning to walk again, slowly, steadily, without the weight of regret dragging me down. "We'll build something good," I said, my voice low but firm. "Not just for us, but for everyone who's been living in the shadows. It's time to stop hiding." Ilara smiled, a small, quiet smile that spoke volumes. "Together," she said, her hand finding mine, the warmth of her touch grounding me. Together, it wasn't just a promise, it was a way of life. We had faced the darkness and walked through it. Now, it was time to embrace the light, to live without fear, and to rebuild what had been broken, not with violence or blood, but with love, with patience, and with the kind of understanding that only comes when you've seen the worst of the world and chosen to rise above it. We continued to walk, the world unfolding before us like an open book, each chapter yet to be written. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the scent of rain, a promise of renewal. In that moment, I knew that everything I had fought for the land, the people, Ilara, was worth it. The battle wasn't over, but it wasn't just about fighting anymore. It was about living, truly living. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was finally on the path towards something worth fighting for, not just survival, but something greater, a future, a home. With Ilara by my side, I no longer feared what lay ahead. Together, we would rebuild what had been lost, step by step, one day at a time. If you're watching on television, don't hesitate, grab your phone, and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. The dust of Silver Peak lingered long after Scar had fallen. The silence in the town felt more oppressive than the gunfire had hours before. It hung in the air like a heavy shroud, suffocating and still, as if the land itself was taking a breath, holding it. People-worn faces, tired eyes emerged from the shadows like ghosts. There were no cheers, no shouts of victory. The silence wasn't one of triumph, but of survival. The weight of everything that had passed was too heavy to be shrugged off so easily. But there was something else beneath that silence, something fragile, something new, hope. The people of Silver Peak didn't look at me with suspicion anymore. When their eyes met mine, they weren't filled with fear, but with something different. I could see the flicker of a possibility in their gazes. Hope, perhaps. A few picked up their tools and returned to their work. A woman lifted her child, cradling the small figure against her chest, as though trying to protect something more precious than just a life. The sheriff, once broken by Scar's rule, now stood taller, his badge catching the last streaks of daylight, as if he, too, had come back to life in the quiet aftermath. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the town, the sheriff approached me. His footsteps were measured, slow, the kind of walk that comes when a man is contemplating something serious. "You could stay," he said, his voice low, rough from years of disuse. "Help me keep order. Be the law this town deserves." I looked at him, but there was no answer I could give him that would satisfy either of us. The truth settled in my chest like a stone. Silver Peak wasn't mine. My place wasn't here, in this town that had been built on the bones of broken men, where people had been ground down by fear and greed for so long. I knew it. The sheriff knew it. I had found what I needed, but it wasn't a job or a home, it was a purpose that moved with me wherever the wind carried us. I turned to Alara, who stood close beside me, her hand folded softly into mine. Her eyes were on the horizon, where the last light of day bled into the sky, and I could see in her gaze the same truth I felt deep inside me. We had done what we came to do, and now it was time to leave. "Are you ready?" I asked her, my voice low, almost reverent. There was no need to say more. She knew what I meant. She smiled a small, sad smile, but steady, a smile that said everything we needed to say without words. "We have done what we needed to do here. It's time." And so, with that quiet understanding, we left at dawn, two riders against the rising sun. The air was sharp with morning chill, the kind that wakes your lungs and clears your mind. The land around us seemed to hold its breath as we passed, as though it, too, knew that something had shifted. Behind us, Silver Peak stirred to life. The sound of hammers striking wood, the distant murmur of voices daring to rise again from the ashes of despair. It was the first sound of a new beginning, a city reborn. But the road ahead was still uncertain, and I wasn't sure if the town's rebirth would last. The air carried a sense of something unsettled, something still waiting to break loose. But ahead of us, the open desert stretched wide, endless and uncertain. We rode in silence for miles, not emptiness, but fullness, like the space between stars. The desert, once barren and hostile, now felt alive. Every wind that swept across the open plains carried sage and dust, each gust a whisper from the land itself. Every horizon we reached promised something new, something we couldn't yet name. The desert was no longer just a wasteland. It was a place of possibility, a canvas for the future. We were no longer fugitives, no longer broken remnants of war or bloodshed. We were wanderers, seekers, lovers. Nights were spent camping under the stars, her head resting on my chest while the coyotes sang their mournful songs in the distance. The sky seemed endless, a sea of stars too vast for the human eye to grasp. Days were spent riding through valleys where the rivers carved silver lines through the rock, where wildflowers dared to bloom despite the cruelty of the sun. Each mile we traveled, each sunrise, brought us closer to something deeper than survival. It brought us closer to understanding. Each morning, when the first rays of light broke over the horizon, I saw Ilara's face illuminated by the soft glow of dawn. She had become my guide, not just through the land, but through this new life. We weren't running anymore. We were walking towards something, but I wasn't sure what yet. Perhaps it was a future, or perhaps it was just another day in the long journey we had embarked on together. Even as peace wrapped itself around us like a blanket on a cold night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. There were still shadows in the world, men like Scar who thrived on fear and greed, and who would never stop trying to take what they could by force. The Wild West was not a land that stayed quiet for long, and sometimes, in the hush of dawn, I wondered if fate was merely giving us a pause before the next storm. One evening, as the fire crackled low and the world darkened around us, Ilara slipped her hand into mine, her fingers soft against my weathered skin. Her eyes, warm from the firelight, were fixed on the stars above. She whispered the names of stars, teaching me the constellations of her people. I listened, not just to the words, but to the music of her voice, each syllable soft as river water, each story a reminder of how far we had come. Then, for reasons I can't explain, she placed my palm against her belly. A silence thicker than the desert night fell between us. I could hear nothing but the crackling of the fire, the gentle breeze in the trees, the distant howls of coyotes. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked into her eyes, and though she said nothing, I understood. The breath caught in my throat. My chest tightened. The universe itself seemed to pause, the stars above us dimming just for a moment, as if they too were holding their breath. I felt something stirred deep within me, something new, something terrifyingly beautiful. A child. Our child. The thought filled me with a joy so fierce it almost hurt. Not born of violence or survival, but of love, our love. A miracle in a land where miracles were scarce. In that fragile, unspoken moment, I felt time stretch and bend around us. The world outside the dangers, the bloodshed, the endless pursuit of something better seemed to fall away. It was just the two of us now, and the promise of something new, something pure. But as much as I wanted to believe that this would be enough, that a cabin in a hidden valley, a quiet life, and the laughter of children would be our destiny, something in the way the wind howled that night, restless and wild, told me otherwise. The next morning before dawn I rose. The fire was ash, the stars fading. The first light of day was still a long way off, and the world around us was still dark, still waiting for the sun to rise. I watched Ilara sleep, her face calm, her hair spread across the blanket like ink spilled over parchment. Her body rose and fell with each steady breath, and for a moment, the weight of everything we had faced seemed to lift. She looked peaceful, content. But my chest ached, a deep, familiar ache that I couldn't ignore. Deep down, I knew the truth. Peace never stays. The road always calls. At sunrise, we saddled up once more. We did not go to her people. We did not go to a town. We rode toward the sunrise, toward the unknown. We did not speak as we left. The sound of hooves on the hard ground was the only sound, the only rhythm we followed. The desert stretched out before us, endless and uncharted. Only the memory of two riders chasing something bigger, a future we couldn't yet name. Perhaps we'd find that valley someday, or perhaps storms still waited. But I knew one thing for certain. As long as we rode together, the horizon would never end. And that's the truth about cowboy love stories. Never tidy, never finished. Tales of freedom, healing, and a Wild West love that refuses to die. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments. I wanted to believe that was enough. That a cabin in a hidden valley, a quiet life, and the laughter of children would be our destiny. But something in the way the wind howled that night, restless and wild, told me otherwise. The next morning, before dawn, I rose. The fire was ash, the stars fading. I watched Ilara sleep, her face calm, her hair spread across the blanket like ink spilled over parchment. My chest ached. Deep down, I knew, peace never stays. The road always calls. At sunrise, we saddled up once more. We did not go to her people. We did not go to a town. We rode towards the sunrise, towards the unknown. Only the memory of two riders chasing something bigger, an unwritten, uncertain future. Perhaps we'd find that valley someday, or perhaps storms still waited. All I knew, as long as we rode together, the horizon would never end. And that's the truth about cowboy love stories. Never tidy, never finished. Tales of freedom, healing, and a Wild West love that refuses to die. Today's story is about pains that seemed to have no way out until a small ray of light changed everything. Do you believe that, even in the darkest times, there's always a miracle waiting at the end of the road? And if deep down you still believe that God is watching over you, quietly arranging everything, then right now, leave a comment AMEN below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write it, a blessing may quietly find its way into your life.